In this video, we'll be exploring Australia's involvement on the Western Front from 1916 to 1918. After Gallipoli, the Anzacs were sent to fight on the Western Front. The Western Front was where the Allies were fighting the Central Powers. It had developed into a stalemate and consisted of a shifting and complex series of trenches that stretched for hundreds of miles from the coast in Belgium to the border of Switzerland. Each side defended their trenches with heavy artillery, machine guns, barbed wire and landmines. Neither side had developed an effective offensive strategy that was successful, and for the most part, the battles that took place along this front were incredibly costly in terms of human lives. The Western Front became known as the meat grinder to the soldiers that fought there, as approximately 1.5 million people were killed. So why did they fight at the Western Front? Both the Allies and the Central Powers expected this war to be over very quickly. In fact, both thought it would be over before Christmas. Germany had developed a plan to defeat France in 6 weeks, but it failed. This plan was called the Schlieffen Plan. As they invaded France through Belgium, they were held up and forced to dig in. The British could not penetrate the German lines and were also forced to dig in. The war soon developed into a stalemate as each side charged enemy lines with infantry and failed. So what was the Western Front like? Well, neither side were prepared for this kind of war, as new weapons from the Industrial Revolution were put to use. Both sides had prepared for a mobile war using cavalry and swift manoeuvres. The Western Front was a complex series of trenches that stretched for hundreds of miles and was hard to take. There were many battles fought along the Western Front, and the guns raged day and night. Allied trenches were hastily built and often filled with water and mud, causing trench foot. German trenches were far better constructed. The dead were often left to rot on the battlefield, causing diseases such as typhoid and dysentery. Have a look at this diagram and see if you can identify some of the problems that attacking troops faced on the Western Front. Going over the top was when troops would leave their trenches to attack the enemy. Allied attacks typically started with an artillery barrage. While this was happening, most of the Germans would hide in their dugouts. Once the barrage had ended, they would come out and prepare for the assault. Allied troops would then leave their trenches, going over the top, and they'd start making their way across no man's land, making their way through mud and craters, and cutting their way through barbed wire. Of course, while this was happening, the Germans would open fire with artillery and machine guns. Look at the diagram and take notice of how the machine gun fire would cross, creating death zones which were difficult to survive. Allied soldiers would have to survive all of this before they made it into enemy trenches, where hand-to-hand combat would take place. There were many famous battles on the Western Front. Look at these and see if you can match them with the correct dates. There's no doubt that the conditions on the Western Front were pretty bad. Look at these sources and try to think of what it might be like for soldiers at the time. The Western Front developed into a war of attrition, with each side trying to wear the other down. Over time, the Central Powers began running out of resources. This had a negative effect on the morale of the soldiers on the front line, as there were food shortages. Not only that, but the people on the home front also felt these effects. The first tanks were ready for battle in 1916, but they proved ineffective. They were slow and so heavy they sunk in the mud. People also died from exhaust fumes inside them. By 1918, however, the tank had become an effective weapon and helped to break the German lines. In 1917, Russia quit the war and the United States entered the war. The entry of the United States gave the Allies a huge morale boost and many more troops and weapons to use against the Central Powers. It wasn't long before Germany surrendered.